the long war, an unfinished world's tale. Before the beginning of time, there was only the endless void, and in that void dwelt the Gart. Greatest among them was Armanhagen, who dreamed a sun into being and set 7 barren worlds to circle it. He called 7 greater and 7 lesser of his kind and gave them the worlds, saying only, "Make them live." Then he turned away to dream larger things. This is the story of the second world, which the gods would later name Kharis. The greater Gaiart of Kharis was called Kael. He was tall and severe, and his mind moved like the slow advance of glaciers. He believed that creation should be ordered, permanent, and obedient. The lesser was Sira, smaller, quicker, restless in a way that never fully settled. Where Kael looked at the barren rock and saw a surface that must be disciplined into lasting form, Sira looked and saw something that could be changed again and again without ever being finished. At first they worked as the other pairs did. Kael raised great plateaus of black stone and cut deep, geometric valleys whose walls were almost perfectly straight. He set the bones of the world with care and without tenderness. When a region was finished, he would stand on the highest ridge and look outward, measuring what he had made against some private standard of permanence. Sira worked in the spaces he left behind. She filled the low places with tough grasses and sharp-leaved trees that could survive the cold winds. She taught water to gather in the deep channels Kael had cut, and she coaxed the first small creatures into being things that burrowed, things that climbed, things that moved in short, cautious bursts across the open ground. For a long age there was no quarrel. The world of Kharis grew according to a clear and shared design. Then Sira began to experiment. She made a creature that did not simply endure the cold. It learned to change. When the wind grew harsher, its coat thickened. When food became scarce, it grew leaner and more patient. When Kael raised a new ridge across its migratory path, the creature did not die against the stone. It found another way around, and in finding that way it became something slightly different from what Sira had first intended. Kael noticed the change. He came down from the high places one evening and stood beside her while a herd of the new creatures moved across a valley he had spent decades leveling. "You are introducing disorder," he said. "I am introducing life," Sira answered. "Life that will not keep the shape it is given is not life. It is error." Sira looked at the herd for a long time. One of the younger animals had stopped and was testing the air, ears turning toward a sound the others had not yet heard. "Then correct it," she said. Kael did. He reshaped the valley overnight, raising new ridges that forced the herd into narrow channels where many were crushed between walls of stone. He altered the soil so the grasses Sira had made grew brittle and snapped under the creature's feet. He considered the matter settled. Sira did not. She answered by creating something that could not be so easily contained. On the highest peaks Kael had claimed as his own she placed winged things lean, sharp-eyed, and stubborn. When he drove them from one summit, they simply took another. When he made the air thinner, they learned to ride colder currents. Each correction he made only taught them new ways to survive him. Some of the winged ones began to watch the ground below with an attention that felt almost personal. They learned the difference between Kael's movements and Sira's. They did not understand the difference, but they felt it. The contest began in earnest. What had been quiet disagreement became open opposition. Kael would raise a fortress-like range of mountains. Sira would fill its canyons with fast-breeding, tunneling creatures that weakened the stone from within. Kael would dry a region to starve her forests. Sira would teach the remaining trees to drink from deeper water and grow thorns that poisoned anything he sent against them. The living things of Kharis became the instruments of the quarrel. Some were shaped into living walls, others into scouts, or weapons, or slow-moving monuments that celebrated one god's temporary victory over the other. Among the tunneling creatures, there was a lineage that began to carry something more than instinct. They remembered, in a rough and wordless way, the feel of stone that had once been safe, and the feel of stone that had been turned against them. When they dug with a kind of inherited anger. When they broke through into a new chamber and found it already collapsing under Kael's pressure, the survivors did not simply flee. They left marks on the walls, deep, deliberate gouges that the next generation would find and continue. Sira noticed the marks. She did not stop them. Centuries passed in the long count of the gods. The world of Kharis grew scarred and strange. Vast regions locked into permanent conflict. Rivers were redirected as weapons. Forests were burned, regrown, and burned again. The creatures that survived became harder, more cunning, and more cruel. Some began to gather at the edges of battlefields after the fighting had moved on, turning over the bodies of the fallen as if searching for a meaning that was never there. One particular strain of the ground dwellers developed a habit that troubled even Sira. After a collapse, the survivors would drag the broken bodies of their own kind into the deepest tunnels and arrange them in careful patterns. They did not eat them. They did not abandon them. They simply placed them, generation after generation, in the same spiral shapes, as if the act itself was a kind of answer to a question they could not ask aloud. Kael saw the patterns once, when he split a mountainside open to punish a particularly stubborn infestation. He stood over the exposed chamber and looked down at the spirals of bones and dried flesh. "They are beginning to make meaning out of the conflict," he said. Sira stood beside him, wind pulling at her hair. "They are beginning to remember it. Memory of this kind is inefficient. It will slow their usefulness. Perhaps usefulness was never the point." Kael turned his head slightly. It was always the point. He closed the mountain again, burying the spiral chambers under tons of new stone. The next generation of tunnelers simply began the patterns over again, deeper than before. The war intensified. Kael created towering, slow-moving beasts whose only purpose was to grind forests into mulch and pack the earth so hard that nothing Sira made could take root. Sira responded with swarms of small, biting things that entered the beasts through the soft places around the eyes and drove them mad from within. Whole regions became graveyards of half-buried titans, their bodies forming new ridges that later generations of creatures treated as natural landscape. The winged ones watched it all from above. Some of them began to interfere in small ways, dropping stones onto Kael's larger creations, or carrying seeds from Sira's remaining forests into places he had declared barren. They did not do this out of loyalty. They did it because the war had become the only weather they had ever known, and they had started to feel, in their limited way, that the weather could be pushed. Kael found their interference unacceptable. He spent a long season thinning the air across the highest ranges until many of the winged ones simply fell. The survivors retreated to the coldest peaks and grew quieter, more watchful, and more bitter. Sira walked among the dead for a time after that. She did not speak. When she returned to the lower slopes, her face had changed in a way that even Kael noticed. "You are becoming attached," he said. "I am becoming responsible," she answered. "There is no difference." The war continued. Then, on a night when the stars over Kharis seemed unusually sharp and close, a seam opened above the highest of Kael's remaining mountains. The visitor who stepped through was the same greater Gaiart who had once appeared on the Third World. He looked out over the ruined plains, the burning forests, the endless slow movement of armies that no longer remembered why they fought, and for the first time something like genuine interest showed in his face. "Armanhagen has been watching," he said to Kael. "This world is no longer merely practice. The pattern of sustained conflict has proven instructive." Kael inclined his head. "Then the work continues." "It continues," the visitor agreed. "But the terms have changed. The war itself is now the experiment. You will not be permitted to end it, nor will she." He glanced toward Sira, who stood some distance away, the wind lifting her dark hair. "She will keep creating. You will keep opposing. The living will keep dying and adapting and, it seems, remembering. Armanhagen wishes to see how long such a system can endure before it collapses under its own weight or learns to exist without either of you." The visitor stepped back through the seam. The air closed as if nothing had ever been there. Kael and Sira stood on the mountain for a long time afterward. Below them, the war went on without pause. Fires moved across the dark plains like slow constellations. In the deep tunnels, the spiral patterns continued to grow. On the highest peaks, the remaining winged ones sat in silence, watching the two gods with an attention that had become almost personal. "So we are no longer makers," Sira said quietly. "We are fuel." Kael's voice was colder than the wind. "We were always fuel. Now we simply know it." Sira looked down at the world she had helped make and could no longer unmake. Somewhere in the darkness, a new generation of tunnelers was already arranging the dead into the old familiar spirals. Somewhere else, a young winged creature was testing the edge of a thermal, learning the shape of a sky that had only ever been a battlefield. Then we will give him a war worth watching, she said. Kael did not answer. He simply turned and began walking toward the next range he intended to raze or destroy. On the second world, the long war went on, no longer a dispute between gods but a mechanism. And somewhere beyond the curve of the sky, Armanhagen watched and dreamed and took notes. This was the second story of the unfinished worlds. 7 worlds, 14 gods, and none of them were ever free. If these unfinished worlds speak to you, like, subscribe, and share the tale. There are still 5 worlds left to tell.